of this under the supervision of BCBS. Shadow banking monitoring is being done through the FSB and IOSCO. This is supplemented by national legislation like two humongous legislations, the Dodd-Frank Act and MiFID II in the Euro area. Now the Basel III reforms are now finalized and complete. By complete does not mean fully implemented, but the process of getting the reform done, that is more or less complete. And the big issues, I think, today are implementing and phasing. Then what should be the regulatory framework for non-banks, which were actually at the epicenter of the global financial crisis? And then the adverse spillovers of reforms on EMDs to be monitored. And as back as in 2012, the G20 had actually commissioned the FSB to come out with recommendations on how to, whether there are adverse spillovers and what to do about it. Well, I'll just skip over these slides. They are there for anybody interested who may want to look later, is what are the phase-in arrangements of Basel II on capital definition, conservation buffers, and what is the full implementation here. And the next slide is on the actual implementation of Basel III. You can see that implementation has begun in real earnest. And if I go on to there's a subsequent slide which gives a country-wise figure. Anybody wants to see, you can go to the FSB website and see what country stands on what reform. So I won't go into that small thing. And the graph on the right-hand side is an interesting one, which shows what is the business model of globally systemically important banks. It seems to have changed towards more less risky assets. And this slide shows that the FSB is now monitoring globally systemically important banks. Every year it is coming out with a list of these systemically important banks, and these are and they've divided them into different buckets of how much extra capital they must use. So there has been action on financial regulatory reform of the banking system. But where do we stand on shadow banking, which was the epicenter of the financial storm 10 years ago? So at the Cannes summit, the G20 leaders had resolved to develop policies to deal with shadow banking. FSB has made recommendations published in 2013. Now these recommendations are still in the process of being translated into operational guidelines. Monitoring is being regularly done by FSB, and every year they report to the G20 on what is the developments in shadow banking, and publishing the list of GCBs every year as part of that process. Resolution for non-banks remains work in progress. The reform agenda for insurance has not kept pace with planned guidelines. This again is implementation on priority areas country-wise. As I said, I'll just skip over anybody interested. These are the other reform areas. What has been the progress? So what has not changed in the regulatory reform process? I think one of the biggest things I feel is mark-to-market unchanged. And the former chairman of FIDIC had very strong views on this, on that mark-to-market can be very destabilizing. And during a crisis, it leads to a distress selling of assets, which actually aggravates the crisis, and which is what happened during the global financial crisis. The firewall between banks and non-bank shadow banks, which was there in the Glass-Steagall Act, the post-Depression era Glass-Steagall Act, that still stands repealed. To some extent, the Volcker rule was some sort of a weak substitute for it, but even that is being diluted. And I think from the way it looks, it might go altogether. The tax treatment that favors leverage over equity, that remains. So there's a inbuilt bias in the system towards leverage. the inability to control overall leverage. Banks have the money creation ability through fractional banking, that remains. There was a Swiss bank initiative to do away with it, but it did not find acceptance. Global imbalances, what do you do? How do you control global imbalances? I think there's no mechanism for this. And then there's a fear that regulatory reform is being diluted over time. Timelines are being rolled back. Incentives for excessive risk-taking, those are being diluted. The Volcker rule has been repeatedly diluted. And now you have President Trump's call for reviewing the Dodd-Frank Act. And then there have been no change in the rules informing monetary policy. And specifically, there was, in the initial phase of the crisis, there was a 1 minute left. I thought you'd come to 5 minutes. Okay, so that monetary policy might address financial stability as well. There would be rules for that, but this has been left to macroeconomic, macroprudential policies. So, okay, the last portion, I have just 2 slides on this. What is this time different? Have things really changed? Now, if you look at the 2003-07 boom was mainly an EMD. Okay, I will skip this because there's only one, unless you indulge me some time, 2-3 minutes, then I can go through this.
Maybe at the time of question.
Okay, so we can come back to this on what has changed since the global financial crisis later. And what are the near-term risks? I think buoyancy in asset prices, populism leading to further decline in international trade. Global imbalances have declined, but most of the domestic imbalances have not, which would indicate that if growth were to increase, global imbalances might come back. Then high levels of debt, which is constraining monetary policy. And with bloated central bank balance sheets and large increase in public debt, there's little policy space for responding to another crisis. Then there's a transmission problem in monetary policy because the US Fed is tightening and the ECB and Bank of Japan are still are not. And there are fears of a EMDE crisis. So I won't have time to go into details of that. Then what are the long-term prospects? Was the GFC just another financial crisis, or has the world radically changed? The world radically changed after the Great Depression. You had the Keynesian revolution. You had, after the stagflation, 0 minutes left. Okay, this is the last slide. After the stagflation, you had the decline of Keynesianism. The monetary policy took the pole position of fiscal policy. And then you had the rise of, the neoliberal market economy, decline of social democracy. Now, I feel global finance, now what has happened after the global financial crisis? I had left out a slide which showed that much has changed, that the world has fundamentally changed after global financial crisis. As you look at growth, you look at, lower growth, rising inequality and unemployment, which has been fueling popular discontent and the resurgence of right-wing populism, which is undermining liberal democracies. And this threatens to make democracies illiberal, as the contours of a sustainable new order are still unclear. And I think either economists and political leaders are not able to find solutions, credible solutions to these problems we've been struggling with since the financial crisis. And so the inability to actually come up with a real, change, a game changer, is leading to instability. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. The way we use whatever time is left is as follows. I'll make a few comments, and then I'll throw the floor open to the House. The comments will not try to repeat what the speakers have said. Try and zero in on a few issues which I had flagged right at the beginning. But the topic today is global financial architecture. And we've started using the word architecture because it's very difficult to get countries to forget their national interests. They are usually paramount. Sometimes when cooperation means furthering national interests, it's the balance. So then countries agree to cooperate either in the framework of an established international organization or something which they set up post 2008. Actually, G20 existed before that at the level of finance ministers and governors of central banks. It was raised to summit level. But let's get to a few points because I think it'd be useful if the House were to, if you want to discuss everything that the speakers have said, then we'll be here till midnight. So let's focus on 3 or 4 things. One is this issue of an international reserve currency. Now, by definition, this will have to be through the mechanism of an international body. We have an international body, for good or for bad. They refuse to change quotas there. It's called the International Monetary Fund. Now, it's 10 years we've been talking about quota reform. Let's forget about that. There is an international currency. Keynes talked about it a long time ago. It's called the SDR. But it doesn't, you can't trade SDRs. You can't go and buy SDRs in the market like you can buy the British pound. So why not? So maybe if there is sufficient consensus within the G20, we try to build an international currency which exists and it has a certain currency composition which changes. The renminbi has been added to it. That no one country can say that you cannot trade for any commodity or any service in the SDR. I'm just using the SDR as an example. If somebody can come up with a better solution, so much the better. But IDA loans, as you know, are denominated in SDRs, and maybe that's one way to go forward. Tax havens, we didn't talk much about that, but in this country, whether it was in the last elections or whatever, much was discussed about tax havens. And every now and then, even in developed countries, as you might recall, somebody in France, I think, released some names of people who have accounts. I will not name the tax havens because there might be somebody here who will object, saying that he or she is the national of that place. As you know, that one person who escaped from here, something to do with jewelry business, is now residing in one such haven. But yeah, next. Tax havens, we have to do something about it. Global financial architecture has to say, look, guys, is this a good thing that people can evade national taxation because some privileged few who are worth a few billion or more can use these havens to hide from the tax person. As I said at the beginning, tax arbitrage is fine, but they are avoiding taxes. Imaginative accounting. I keep going back to things that I said at the beginning, and our speakers have referred to all of them. For instance, Parag referred to beggar thy neighbor monetary policies, which a former Reserve Bank governor also referred to. But the Federal Reserve Chairman responded to it. He says, my remit, my job here is to frame policies as the governor or as the head, they call him the chairman there, of the Central Bank of the United States, which furthers US economic / national interests. He's really not concerned about the US Central Bank shrinking its balance sheet, and to that extent, those who are engaging in carry trade in India are getting hit. So I think, not quite sure. Someone referred to BRI, that is another huge thing in terms of will there be unsustainable debt because of BRI. So that's again something the G20 can discuss profitably. Ashima referred to currency manipulation that the US accuses India of. I mean, these are things that the G20 should discuss. Particularly, countries which have, as was mentioned by Professor Goyal, consistent current account deficits. Always have consistent deficits in our balance of trade in goods and even in current accounts. So should we have some freedom to accumulate reserves? But then the US is uncomfortable because we are accumulating reserves in dollars. Maybe we should all think in terms of accumulating reserves and SDRs. Then you don't feel that pressed in terms of your own domestic monetary policy. Well, I won't get into leverage, liquidity, solvency. Think about that. Those are the issues that are perennials in the financial markets. Leverage, how much leverage is okay? IRFS keeps coming to mind. Liquidity. Well, I would strongly recommend that people have a look if you have the time. You're here, so you're obviously interested in financial sector issues. Martin Wolf has a good article in yesterday's Financial Times, a very good one, where he tracks what's happened to growth in countries around the world, developing and developed, in the last 10 years since the financial crisis. I'll stop there. I think I just wanted to I have not summed up at all. I've not done justice to what the panelists have delivered today in terms of the rich quality of their presentations. Now we have full 15 minutes left. What I will do is request all of you, short question, no more comments, and indicate which panelist the question is directed to. And if it's to the entire panel, you can say that too. There was one person in the audience who requested to be allowed to ask a question even before the session started. He's first in the queue, so I'll request Mr. Sanjay Singh to ask his question.
Thank you, Chair. My question arises from the comments made by the panelists. And one of the comments was weaponization of the US dollar. The other comment was the Chinese dream. And you yourself, Chairman, had talked about oil from Iran. There are Asian interests involved in the global financial architecture. And can we now think of a separate kind of Asian financial architecture? And what would its major emerging aspects look like? This is a question to the panel. Anyone? Thank you.
We'll take a few questions and then we'll let the panel answer. Please, go ahead. Could you identify yourself?
Yes, myself, I'm Professor Dr. Saurabh Agarwal. I'm Professor of Accounting and Finance at Indian Institute of Finance and Associate Editor of Finance India, and also on the governing body of many government organizations like ESIC and also CBWE and also ASSOCHAM. Now, my question is directed to Dr. Ashima Goyal. And so, ma'am, this year's Nobel Prize in Economics has focused on climate change and sustainable development. In your opinion, what nudge does G20 require for a win-win global cooperation so focus remains on multilateralism and not unilateralism? Thank you.
Two more questions before we turn to the panel.
I'm Lieutenant General B.S. Malik. I happen to have stayed into academics. I used to be in the Executive Council of the IDSA, which is the premier strategic think tank of the government of India. I tried when director here, Rajiv Kumar, to put the strategy and the economics together, tried like hell. It didn't materialize. The main point which comes out, you mentioned about market integrity. Parallelly, there was a great effort towards money laundering on the strategic side for various reasons, which I don't have to go. You talked about the national interest. If you go into this growth, what likely to happen, another director of this institute, he talked of the tripolar world, and he talked of the economic foundation of national power. Now, the critical thing that has developed is those people who have the economic strength do not have the national power equivalent to that particular economic strength, so they cannot get the benefit.
Sir,
could the panel explain?
Sir, your question. What is the question?
My question is that we are talking about China. At the same time, there is a talk, and there are people are talking that they may have the economic strength, may not have the national power equivalent to the US. How is this going to work out? Because earlier, US was also looking after the economic architecture and everything is going smoothly. Is this likely to happen? And how is this going to get resolved?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anirudh Shingal. I'm a visiting senior fellow here at ICRIER and also a program associate of the European University Institute in Florence. I have two questions for the panel. Anybody can address them. One, of course, is something that Professor Bhagwati has alluded to, is about the BRI. This is a massively ambitious project from the part of the Chinese. It's a $1 trillion project, and recent research seems to suggest that a lot of this is being financed largely by state-owned enterprise banks in China and by the Chinese Development Bank. There is not too much of transparency on the financing practices, and research is also suggesting that there are implications for debt sustainability. So I would like to know from the panel how they would like these issues to be addressed, and what the implications of this are going to be for the global financial architecture, especially given that China is one of the members of the G20. The other issue and the other question is related to the trade wars between China and the US right now. Again, what do you think are the implications of these trade wars for the dollar renminbi exchange rate and in this globally interconnected world on other monetary policies and currencies of the world? And again, what is there for the G20 to do on this, given that, again, the US and China both are members of the G20? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask the panelists to respond. But before I do so, let's focus on the fact we were talking about architecture, not talking about financial developments in terms of implications of actions taken by country X or Y. You refer to trade wars. I mean, that will set us off in a completely different direction. I think, Professor Goel, there was one question that was addressed to you by name. So maybe you could take that, and then I'll let the panelists answer whichever question they wish to.
Yes, I think it is an interesting issue which was raised, that of climate change. And this is one which really calls for global cooperation, because all of us will suffer. It's a public good in that sense. Combined with that, today you have the US, which was responsible for maintaining many global institutions sort of retreating. So therefore, who is going to come in? And, you know, because I don't really work on climate change, so related to the financial sector, this issue of central bank swaps is a Chiang Mai initiative as a substitute for IMF funding. If the US is going to stop funding the IMF, anyway, their funds are inadequate. I think that there is a way for Asian regional, Chiang Mai would be stronger if the IMF was working with it, you know? So institutional strengthening, using international institutions which are being abandoned by the US in a way. If Asian economies, China, there are problems of hegemony, economic power. There are a lot of Asian countries fear China. So it needs to be backed by stronger institutions and more sort of decentralized or power where you're sort of playing off different, I don't know how it can work, but really using the institutions that have been built up and co-opting them to strengthen regional frameworks might be a way forward. Many areas where international cooperation could gives positive benefits.
Thank you. Suman, would you like to take the question on BRI and also Asian financial architecture?
Well, only in the following sense. I mean, Sanjeev Sanyal, those of you who are here in the inaugural session, you know, talked about the tendency for entropy of large bureaucracies, which he may be right. On the other hand, these are treaty-based organizations. Let's face it, the G20, at the end of the day, is an informal body which lacks the kind of legitimacy of membership and of treaty-based organizations. My own preference as a globalist would be to see what can be done to make these institutions more representative rather than to carve out new institutions. That said, we have to recognize that that is the way things are going, essentially because of the unwillingness of the established powers to agree to the shifts in power that are needed. I remember when I attended the the board of the IMF when I was at the World Bank at the time of the Asian financial crisis. The Japanese at that time said, what about an Asian monetary fund? And it was considered, an unmentionable. And now the Europeans are quite openly talking for the Eurozone or European monetary fund. So my general point is that it would be unfortunate, but as a part of a set of strategies to get, as it were, the established powers to recognize the shift in power that's taking place, it may be necessary. On BRI, I have just the following puzzle. I'm not at the Bretton Woods institutions, but when I did work at the World Bank, there was such a thing as a negative pledge clause. So all countries were required certainly to declare their sovereign debt. The real question always is one of whether these institutions are willing to tell truth to power. My sense is that both the IMF and the World Bank have the tools to compel the Chinese state to fess up to and if not them, the recipient countries. But it is the shyness of doing so. If I could just, with your permission, Chair, somebody made the point, I think it was Parag, about the passionate speech by Raghuram Rajan. He made the point there that the IMF was unwilling to recognize negative spillovers. They kept saying that everything was a positive spillover. And here you now have the managing director of the IMF talking about, trade. For God's sake, you didn't call the negative spillovers when it was in your area, and now you're spending all your time talking about negative spillovers in trade. So I think grappling with how you get existing institutions to be objective and neutral in the face of power, that's the underlying issue. Sorry for exceeding my time.
No, I like that expression, truth, speaking truth to power. There are very few people who do that. Former cabinet minister, who shall remain unnamed, in a book release ceremony at the NMML, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, had much to say, but I was thinking about his role much earlier and how much truth was spoken to power then. But Alok, you go next, and then Professor Parag.
Okay, I would comment on three issues that have been raised. One on the G20's role in relation to climate change, the international reserve currency, global reserve currency, and tax havens. The G20 engaged with all these. On climate change, I think it was one of the spectacular failures of the G20. There were several hours and hours of discussions, but because of different perspectives between developed and developing countries, it was very difficult to agree on the language in communiques. And ultimately what came out was some very bland statements. In G20 communiques, if you come across very bland language, which means there's no consensus. The same thing happened on the international monetary system. Before the Cannes summit, France had raised the issue of the international monetary system. So there was great expectation that the question of a global reserve currency, an alternative, would be on the agenda. But as it happened, it was not even, to the best of my knowledge, not even discussed. Because, what are you going to put on the table? That, the US give up its advantage on the US dollar. And then, the need for a neutral global reserve currency has long been known from the time of Keynes. But the thing is, that desirability does not determine the reserve currency. It is what the market can or will accept. Will it accept the SDR? If you're going to give Iran Indian rupees or the renminbi, will it work? These are things which markets have to give. And ultimately, the global reserve currency is the reserve currency of the predominant global power, and that is the US. And unless that were to change, and if, for instance, the question had come up about China's economic power translating into political power if, let us in the same case of arguments, if the renminbi becomes more acceptable as an alternative to the dollar, to that extent, the shift in part towards China will take place. But that is not happening. That is not even happening in relation to the dollar and the euro. Forget the renminbi. It was expected when the euro came that it might be an alternative to the dollar, but the dollar has gone from strength to strength ever since I started studying economics. I was waiting for the dollar to collapse because of a lot of imbalances in the US system. But the last crisis was the crisis at the heart of the dollar system, and the dollar strengthened, and it continues to strengthen. So there are these hard realities.
Professor Paragi.
I have just a couple of comments. One was, what about the Asian financial architecture? I think one good point which Dr. Berry made was about telling the truth to the powers. And I think one has to recognize that it's ultimately a bargaining game. And so we are going towards a global cooperation, but we still are nation states, and we are not willing to give up our interests so easily, even though there is a greater common good to be achieved. So the incentives need to change for countries to actually participate and move towards global cooperation. And I think having, as trade blocks are also bargaining blocks, similarly, regional financial cooperative blocks could also serve as bargaining blocks towards a greater cooperation at some level. Because our level of aggregation from nation states to a world economy is not going to happen that easily unless the incentives within the system change for country to respond in a certain way. One point about tax havens, if we look at the countries which are tax havens, they are basically very small countries and very affluent countries. And I think they also have strong legal institutions. I mean, that is what the empirical research says about tax havens. So I guess one thing is also, and tax havens have also been used to attract foreign direct investment into those countries. So one way to actually have or reduce the problem of tax havens and its threat to the global financial stability is to improve legal institutions in other countries as well. So I think it goes to the prime question that was raised before by Lucas is why doesn't capital flow to developing countries from developed countries? And one is about the return of capital, which itself is problematic because the institutions in developing countries are problematic. I guess I'll just stop there. We'll have more questions.
Thank you. Alok wants a minute, although we are over time, so I seek your indulgence because we are eating into your lunch time. Go ahead, Alok.
Just 1 minute. I forgot to mention, the issue of G20 and tax havens. Very early on, the G20 recognizing the fact that there's a problem in international finance, and you have large pools of capital in obscure places like Cayman Islands and others. So they prepared a list of compliant and non-compliant jurisdictions. And my understanding is now the FSB, when it monitors financial regulatory reforms, it does it by jurisdictions, and it has 21 jurisdictions plus the euro area. So if you include the euro countries as individual, 29 jurisdictions which cover a major proportion of global financial assets. So those are now compliant as far as the FSB is concerned. Yes, there would be areas like obscure, small economies where people can still escape. But as, and the sort of money which we are talking about in India is by the viewpoint of, the global economy or global finance, a small portion. Yes, that will take place. But if you look at it at the macro level, most of the jurisdictions which have the largest proportion of financial flows are compliant and monitored by the FSB. I don't know.
Thank you. I have many things to say about who's compliant with what, but we are now past the time that was allocated for this session. I'm sorry, there were some hands at the back. You couldn't ask your questions, but perhaps over lunch, over the lunch break, you can address your questions to the panelists. But before we close, I want to thank all 4 panelists. I think we have had a very interesting session. So may I request the audience to give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you.
So now we're breaking for lunch, and we'll be resuming at 1:30 with one of the most interesting sessions of this conference, that is on future of work. Thank you. See you at 1:30.